Okay, folks. My name's Josh Ambrosi, and thank you very much for attending this webinar run with ASHBA. I work for Federation University as a lecturer in outdoor education. And I think what I'd like to do first is acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting today. So obviously, it's something that we're attending from all different parts of the state and possibly even further away. As part of that, we want to, I think sometimes it's really important to think about the idea of using things like Indigenous knowledge in times like these. So one of the ways we can do that is to start to think about the idea of places having embedded knowledges as part of ways of learning. So what types of knowledges can we learn from the place? And I think that that is something that we can really keep in the forefront of our mind today. Just a couple of housekeeping things. You should all be able to see a chat, and we have Adriana from ASHBA here who is going to be helping to moderate that a little bit. So if you do have questions throughout the chat or throughout the presentation, please feel free to pop those up, and Adriana will either sort of park those till we will have some Q&A time at the end, or she may also help me to, I suppose, answer those as they come about. I'll also try and keep a little bit of an eye on the chat, but it is a little bit complicated in terms of having a few things on the go at one time, as I'm sure you can all appreciate. So getting into it, today our aim is to consider the current situation and government advice around the notion of COVID-19 or coronavirus and the implications of that on teaching VCE OES. Now, I should also state that obviously this is a very ongoing and dynamic situation, as I'm sure you are all aware and being made aware of through the various channels and school types of settings that you are able to access. So obviously the advice or the kind of things that we want to think about today is probably twofold, and it's the idea being that we want to go through a number of different situations that might occur or possibly will occur over the next little while regarding the idea of outdoor experiences when it comes to teaching the VCE OES. So obviously a Victorian specific context here. As part of that, what we're going to be doing today is really looking at the idea of, what is an experience within the VCE OES study design? How can you still deliver an experience as part of that if you are able to deliver things on site at school or in a very localized context? Or alternatively, how are you able to potentially still deliver some experiences, whether that be virtually or as student delivered or student self-managed types of learning experiences. As part of that, we'll firstly have a look at some of the current policy information that's been put out by the department, and then also look at, I suppose, a couple of ideas around some practical things that you might be able to use to deliver the course depending on where you are up to.
I'm just going to quickly jump in there, Josh.
Yep.
Just very quickly, and I did pop a note in the chat feed. We do have a couple of interstate attendees on the call, so we're obviously going to focus particularly, as Josh said, on the Victorian Certificate of Education. There will be some similarities in how you run within other states. So just keep that in mind, and obviously make sure that you alter content to suit your state's subject guidelines.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Adriana. So this is the current advice that is up now. Obviously, with the bringing forward of the school holidays in Victoria, camps and excursions, just like pretty much all schooling, is currently on hold. and we don't know what is going to be going on for the first couple of weeks of term 2 at least. So I think that, you know, one of the approaches that Adriana and I have spoken about in terms of developing today was about the idea of trying to get a few different ideas for a few different contexts and situations, so that as teachers we can continue to be dynamic and change our response depending on what might happen. So the current, or, you know, prior to the obvious implementation of today, the rules around excursions, or the advice around excursions, was basically that they weren't to happen unless they were something like a very localized context that's regularly used by the school. And so I know that there are a number of schools that might teach OES, and they might almost sort of see the, you know, the park that's across the back fence as the extension of the playground, and they're there all the time, and that's just a normal part of school business. So under the advice that is currently on the department website, and has been the advice we've been following for a week or two now, those types of very, very localized, you know, not getting on a bus, but potentially walking to the park that's on the other side of the fence, that sort of stuff is okay. And also things like traveling between campuses. So I know a number of different institutions or different schools might have multiple campuses, and some of them might have the opportunity for things like a localized or a campus-based experience more than some of the other campuses, depending on your school makeup. So obviously just something to continue to be aware of. It's on the front page of the department website. Keep up to date with what is going on there, and obviously talking to your principals and other school leaders about what you are able to achieve. So moving on, so just a really quick reminder and refresher about the idea of what is an outdoor experience within OES. So I think that it's very easy for us to think of the traditional notions of an outdoor experience as part of the idea of delivering the OES course. And often it is the default when we are planning that we might think, oh, you know, I want to do this walk because I think that a bushwalk might work really well for something like maybe unit 1, area study 2, when we're starting to look at rationales and codes and conduct. So that might work really well. Where am I going to go bushwalking? Well, maybe something iconic like the Grampians and the Pinnacle would be a great thing, because it'll give the students a really good, unique opportunity, my apologies there, to be able to experience that. I suppose that one of the things that we do need to remember is that the advice is, and has continued to be for a long time, that the notion of experience within OES can be quite varied. And I think, and you know, I'm sure that VCAR would probably have quite a similar opinion, that, you know, normally we obviously do want you to take the students out and experience some of those amazing parts of Victoria. Normally we'd obviously encourage things like the idea of localized excursions, so students can learn their home place, but also the idea of further away ones they've got things to compare and contrast. In the unprecedented situation that we are in, obviously we probably need to be more dynamic as a group and think about the idea of, you know, what are the types of experiences that we may be able to still do within the current advice around social distancing when schools could go back to being face-to-face, or alternatively, what are the types of experiences that we could get students to partake in a very safe and very controlled manner, that's not seeing them all, you know, going to try and meet as a big group, but potentially undertaking something with their, you know, within their street even, or, you know, within a couple of 100 meters of their house, not in contact with anyone else. And so I think that it's a good time to just take stock and go, well, an experience is really just a time that we take, or a time that we have an interaction with the outdoors. And what's also really important, and I'll pop up the next slide, and this is text directly from, and I'm sure many of you will have been involved in the VCAR implementation briefing as of the start of the current study design, is that they can very much be school-based things. They can be localized things, and they can be things that they don't require students to go necessarily out of the school. Now, as part of that, I think that in particular in the current context, it would be okay, Paul, fantastic, a virtual experience. So, and that's a couple of things we're going to talk about today. So as much as these may not have been our default options when we planned the course and, you know, thought about this is the best OES course that I want to deliver within the context that I can, obviously it's a time where we're all as educators having to be as dynamic as we possibly can. So something like a virtual experience, and we'll unpack a couple of different options of that today, is I think quite appropriate and still can meet the requirements of an experience that would constitute a learning experience for the students to then be able to form the basis of something like the journal task or something like another SAC, or even just some formative assessment and learning if that's the path that you go down. And I know there has been some advice from VCAR today, or some further advice, so well worth checking out their website, and I'm sure that a lot of you would have seen that through things like the VCE OES teacher page.
Josh, just jumping in there was a comment from Paul just wondering whether virtual experiences are in that list.
Yeah, so I believe that virtual experiences have always been a okay thing to do. Obviously, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily want to, you know, in normal situations, replicate again and again and again, and just have virtual experiences. But I know, having been to the briefing where that's the original text from that slide is from, and having discussions with VCAR around the idea of, you know, it is okay to say, rather than having the guest speaker where you'd normally go down to the local historian or the local historical society and have the speaker there, that you can Skype that person in and still have that similar type of experience. Because again, you know, the notion of experience is about having some form of contact with the outdoors. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to physically be in that locality. All right, so we're going to move on, and the rest of the presentation is going to be sort of structured into two parts. And one of them is the idea of what could you do at your school, or super localized. So not necessarily even thinking about the park that's a 5-minute bus ride away, thinking about, you know, where you could walk, meeting those requirements as they are worded at the moment around the idea of, you know, what is a local venue that the school regularly uses. So a couple of years ago, and some of you might have been at the session at the ASPA conference that some of my colleagues from Federation, Alex Prins and Brian Watchow, or affectionately known as Ponch and Princey, ran. And they ran a activity that was called Camp on Campus. And the idea was that they did a whole lot of activities that you might have normally done as part of an outdoor experience that you might typically do offsite. And the idea was to sort of think through the lens of, well, if you can't leave the school because of whether it be financial constraints or other constraints like the current situation, you know, what are the types of things that you could still do and still deliver to meet similar learning outcomes without leaving the school premise? And I think that one of the ideas around this was that, you know, there are a whole lot of things that you might normally embed within your outdoor program on a trip, and you could definitely bring those back and do those at your school context. Eliza, I see you've got a question there. We might hold that one for the end, because that's sort of general stuff around assessment, and we're going to finish with a slide on assessment as well. So the first idea that we had was that I've got here is to look at the idea of, you know, you could look at relevant technologies. So looking at Unit 1, Area Study 2, so probably something that's coming up for a lot of you who are teaching 1-2 this year. What are the relevant technologies and their effects on outdoor experience? So obviously this is something that you can do, and a lot of outdoor editors might do something like, you know, using different levels of technology that have developed over time. So something like a canvas tarp as an example versus a lightweight bivvy, and even having the students set those up on campus, practicing good social distancing, practicing good hygiene. It should become quite apparent quite quickly that, you know, the use of lightweight materials such as synthetic materials rather than things like brushed cotton canvas have really enhanced the ability for people to experience the outdoors. And, you know, if anyone's ever done an activity like that, you would know that it is significantly easier, and particular things like having to tie rolling fours with so, you know, having to learn and tie knots with a canvas thing rather than having the little pre-made plastic toggles on the newer tarps and bivvies, obviously makes the experience a lot easier. So that's just a simple idea of something that you could do on campus or at your local park to be able to still embed that type of thing. I think that when we think about, you know, ideas around personal responses to risk and personal responses to safety and competence and perceived risk, we often go straight away to things like peak activities or peak adventures, and things like, you know, great examples have typically been something like rock climbing. You know, when you first partake in rock climbing, you might think, oh, geez, this is a bit dangerous because I'm 20 meters up in the air. But realistically, what we know, and there's a really good link there to the Uploads project that is well worth looking at when you are looking at that part of the course. What we do know is that things like campfire cooking, or what Uploads term as campcraft, is actually one of, I think it's within the top 6 incident per capita ratings. So the Uploads project looks at a whole lot of incidents, and they look at how many times that incident happens per participation rate. And realistically, I think a lot of students would think, oh, we're making a cup of tea on the billy here. We're just using our transiers outside the gear shed or outside the gym or whatever it is, and they wouldn't necessarily see that as something that they perceive as being a risky based activity or something that you can build competence in, but the reality is actually quite different. So you could still be, I suppose, in a way flipping it on its head. So rather than going to do those more peak type of activities and teaching about, you know, that they are you know, actually quite safe in terms of their usage of rigorous safety standards, rock climbing being a typical example, going the opposite and going, well, this is something that we think, you know, it's just an everyday activity, but realistically, something like a transier cook, there is obviously still incidences of accidents. So something that we all should really be aware of from a risk and safety perspective, and putting in place really, you know, stringent measures around that. I think that, you know, there's other opportunities like to also start to perceive and view the places that we look at and are able to access in these times a bit differently. And something like, you know, we often might talk about when we're looking at influencers and media portrayals, things like the Instagram phenomenons and things like the photos of the pinnacle with the person having their lovely sunset shot up there and popping it on Instagram without a filter or with a filter or whatever it is that they feel that they need to do. And, you know, interestingly, you know, what influence does that have? We know the Grampians has had a massive surge in visitor numbers, in particular something like the Pinnacle Walk, as a result of a lot of things like Instagram shots. So, you know, you could almost flip that again and think about, well, what could I get the students to do on campus? You know, could they create the most beautiful Instagram shot on campus and try and, or in a way, you know, sort of look at that lens of how an image or something like a or portrayal is really able to, you know, influence people and, oh, geez, I really want to go and see that really tiny little micro bit of garden because it's actually something really beautiful and I want to have that experience. Or, you know, oh, that student found at their local parkland this side, you know, this little cubby that had naturally grown out of the vegetation. Geez, isn't that something I would want to do? I've actually been influenced by a portrayal in this case. So it's, again, just maybe thinking about how can we flip those, you know, traditional notions or things that a lot of us have probably done for a long time and think about them a little bit differently within the bounds and obviously the guidelines around social isolation. All right, so another one that you could definitely do on a local level, and this is one that I think you could do either by being able to go somewhere if you do have one of those sort of very localized type of parks, if that is something that you can continue to do and that your principal class is happy with, or, you know, it might be something that you could just draw on students' prior experience of, oh, do you remember, you know, how for the last 5 years we've done cross country and we've always run through this area of parkland. one of the recent VAC investigations was actually a statewide assessment of public land. And potentially something that you could do would be to visit that area, whether it's a direct experience or an indirect experience, or potentially, you know, drawing on previous experience that the students might have already had through their schooling, and think about the idea of, you know, has that been influenced in the last couple of years from that statewide assessment. So I think the statewide assessment happened in, it was either 2017 or 2018. And what you will find when you go on that that link there, and potentially also table on page 16 of the draft recommendations, you'll actually see that a whole lot of different public land has had really minor, but, you know, not insignificant name changes. And with those name or reclassification changes, then there's also often ramifications for things like land management, for things like access, for things like different abilities for people to go there. Obviously, that is a really good example that you can then bring back and go, well, what is the VAC and what do they do? They are an independent statutory authority that is commissioned by the minister in charge of the current Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, or whatever the name has been in the past. And they were charged at that time, a couple of years ago, to do a new statewide assessment of public land. And there has been some changes that are not insignificant around the management of different areas of the state as a result of those changes. So obviously bringing something like that into the VAC topic can be a really good tangible example to be able to demonstrate to students, look, you know, this is the type of advice that VAC gives, and it is, you know, there are some historic cases of that, and there's also some I suppose, you know, more mundane or more everyday types of examples where the VAC has been able to influence different parts of the state and the public landscape that we have in that. My apologies for the dog barking if you can hear it in the background. All right, another one that you could definitely do is a very localized case study, and this is the same study design link. So 3.2.4, an overview of environmental politics in Australia. So one of the points there, or the sub points, being the environmental policies of the major Australian political parties. So, you know, and I think it's really good, again, with some of these more heavy and dense types of study design points, that, you know, there is possibly sometimes a tendency to maybe go a little bit theoretical on this, is to still be able to have some form of experience. So the photo on the screen there is actually a 2018 image that Adriana would be able to tell you is the block of housing immediately adjacent to the Ashborough office, I believe. And what you can actually do on Google Earth is you can go on there and you can see, obviously, the 2020 satellite imagery, or this will be an aerial photo because of the zoom in level. And you could potentially make a map around your school and sort of say to students, look, you know, as you're traveling to school in the morning, I want you to, you know, not do anything different, just observe, have there been any things like solar rooftop installations? So an example of the current Labor government's environmental policy was that the Andrews government went to the 2018 election with a commitment to provide a subsidy for 700,000 homes of rooftop solar. And what you will typically see, and I believe when I was looking at this one and looked at the 2021, so again, something you could probably do both in class or out if you aren't able to go out into that localized area, is you could look at, you know, how has our area been affected by that government policy? You know, this is a direct link between the idea of the government policy wanting to make, you know, wanting to promote something like rooftop solar and a shift towards renewable energy based on their the party policy that'll have a certain target around 2030 emissions and 2050 emissions. This is a tangible example that we can show and demonstrate that. So, you know, obviously very important to help students to tie that example to the specific terminology and the specific part of the study design, and not get muddled up with the Unit 4 actions to sustain, but instead be able to use it as a tangible, specific example where they can say, in Murphy Street, Richmond, this many solar panel installations have been installed since this time, as an example of the Andrews Labor government's shift towards a more renewable energy usage in Victoria. Going to move on from sort of school-based and local things. Just wondering if there's any quick questions before I do so. Excellent. So obviously something that we will most likely all be faced with in the coming months is potentially the idea of a period of time that we might be delivering content at home. And as I mentioned before, the VCAA has put together some advice around that, and definitely worth having a good read and talking to people like your VCE coordinators to ensure that you are meeting all the requirements around assessment. Something that we can continue to do is still continue to develop learning experiences as part of that time at home. Depending on the government advice of the time, it may be appropriate for students to be able to go out very locally within their neighbourhood, maintaining a safe distance from themselves and anybody else, and be able to have a very localized experience where they can perhaps unpack or try and find some examples of the different parts of the study design. Or alternatively, this might be a good time to perhaps deliver some content virtually. So we'll go through a couple of different ideas and examples, and then we'll move on to assessment and some questions. So one of the things that I think would be a really beneficial thing to the students, and I know a lot of you would already integrate within your different OES courses, is the notion of connecting with a local expert or a guest expert, or somebody typically, in the outdoors. I know when I've taught the OES course before, I'd often, if I was in Lawn, the Lawn Historical Society was wonderful, and it's this lovely little museum with very passionate volunteer run people who just had amazing knowledge of the local area. And I know the students are always that it would come out in their sacks and things like that. Obviously the other touch point that we also have with those guides is people like the climbing instructor, the canoe instructor, the Indigenous interpretive person that you might get in. One of the things that I think you could really look towards is the idea of, well, we had this booked for week 3 and, we're potentially going to postpone that one, but maybe we could still use that part of the experience, because we might have to shorten the trip or whatever it is, to be able to still connect with those people. And I think what's really important is to think about the idea that, this current situation is obviously affecting a huge number of people, but the outdoor industry, I think the current stats from the Australian Camps Association is something like 200,000 casual and subcontractor hours lost. So, that often means a lot of these people, a lot of guides, a lot of people who work casually with you and might have done for many years will often be out of work and accordingly out of pocket. So one of the ways that you could potentially A, help to support them, and B, still offer that experience would be to say to that climbing guide, hey, I'd really like you to still go to the Grampians, make sure it's somewhere that's got good phone reception, and I'd like you to Skype us as you do a couple of pictures on that wall and talk to us about the experience. So you can still provide that idea of a secondary experience, that idea of a secondary touch point or a virtual touch point, by being able to do that. And I'm sure there's a significant number of providers that might be living in those local areas. They would still be able to maintain social distancing and go about all of those different requirements of the government whilst being able to connect with you. Or alternatively, they might just be able to connect with you from their lounge room and show you artifacts and examples, or a PowerPoint or something like that. So I think it's still a really good and valid option to have a virtual guest speaker. Obviously, there is support within department schools with platforms like WebEx, and I know a lot of independent and Catholic schools have other alternatives to that as well. So as another way to virtually visit places, a really easy thing to do is Google Expeditions. So Google Expeditions and tours. An expedition can be done as a whole class, and in fact, I'm fairly certain that you can do this remotely, where you can potentially still control the class and still talk your students through and all that sort of stuff. They can use something like a Google Cardboard or a set of 360 goggles so that they can sort of hold their phone up to their face and be able to look around in it. But that platform also has the option that if they don't have something like that at home already, is that they can sort of just scroll across, similar to what you would have done when you experience something like a 360 photo on a social media platform like Facebook or Instagram, where you can get up that photo and you can actually kind of look around within it. There are heaps and heaps and heaps of pre-made Google expeditions which have teaching points associated with them and different things. It's often like a little bit of a script where you can take your class on a virtual expedition. The other thing that you might want to do when thinking about that idea of those virtual experiences is actually have the students make them. So students using the 360 photos that people freely and openly upload to Google Earth are able to actually make their own tour. So you could use that perhaps as a formative assessment task or even a journal task. Where you might be able to, get the students to actually compile, here's 3 different points in the study design. I want you to show me what you know about that by choosing a location you are already familiar with, or perhaps somewhere we have been already this year, if you have already had a trip, and demonstrate that by making a tour and annotating some notes around that as well. I think with both of those types of things, there are significant amounts of study design links that you could find with those. And again, it's very much, similar to the idea of when we go out and do a day or a multi-day experience, that we're probably going to find a whole lot of different experiences, or a whole lot of different links to the study design within the one experience. I see Beck's just got a comment there about the challenge of the homeschool experience. Yeah, and I think that one's going to be something that is going to be challenging, in particular, obviously devices. Both of those, I believe, are things that can happen on, just about any app-based or phone-based device though, Beck. So, potentially it might even be something that you just set over a period of a couple of days. So if the student doesn't have a phone, they might be able to borrow their parents or their siblings or whoever it is phone or iPad or something like that. Hopefully they do have the ability to be able to do that. But I think a really good point, Beck, around access and equity, so making sure students do have access to those types of things is going to be an ongoing challenge. So another way that you could potentially do it would be to give your students, preload them with some theory around the idea of the data that you want them to have. So, that would be not dissimilar to if you were going to use the Apollo Bay Township and surrounding areas for your trip. You'd often preload them with some theory and say, well, as part of this, we want to go and see what conservation is. Well, conservation is an activity that is there to preserve and conserve the environment. This is our perception. These are the types of things. And then, preloading them with some theory beforehand, then be able to go there. And I think that really, by default, and I probably did this as well when I first started the course, was I sort of by default started to think about, I could go 2 hours there and 2 hours here and all that sort of stuff. And absolutely, we want to give students the opportunity to do that within the OES course. But the more I think about the OES course, the more I also realize that I could probably teach, a large amount of the course with examples from my backyard. So, one of them being something like the conservation, recreation, primary industries and tourism, or the 4 pillars of interaction within Unit 3, Area Study 2. You could start to look at, can we find really localized examples of that? So I went out the other day when I was putting this PowerPoint together for a walk, and I found just down the street a good little example of a primary industry, being an apiarist or somebody who's keeping bees. And you can get the students as a learning task, potentially as a bit of formative assessment, to say, look, I want you to make a bit of a PowerPoint for me or complete this table, and I want you to either get a photo from your local area, or if you can't get a photo from your local area for whatever social distancing thing is, the idea of, you know, can you demonstrate an understanding of these types of things within your local area? Now, Adriana has just told me about Beck's comment before that I think was only sent to the panelists. So just a couple of things. If you can, when you are sending a comment or a question, if you can send it to the panelists and all attendees so everybody could see it. But I'll just read out Beck's comment before that I made mention of. So Beck said, the virtual visit via guest speaker is a good idea. Possibly they could draw on their personal images, etc., to help create a visual idea of the experience. Again, this would be okay for when the kids return to school. The challenge is the homeschool experience. So as I sort of alluded to on that previous slide when we were talking about Google expeditions and tours and things like that, you know, the idea of, you know, device and access and things like that is just something we're going to have to continue to be able to work through. And yeah, excellent point there as well, Beck, about the idea of, yep, there's definitely some virtual tours in some of those specky, far off, peak type of places, like Kakadu. And I also do know that the Park Web Learn website does have, I believe, a couple of virtual tours. One of them, I think, is the Castlemaine digging, so that might be good for anything around historical or preservation of historical sites and things. So just a quick reminder, and then we'll move on to some Q&A time. So it's really important, and I know that Rachel Whittle, who's the curriculum manager for this area, has just provided a link around VCAR's advice on assessment and continuity of learning. It's in the chat link there, or I'm sure that you'll be able to find it on their website if you haven't seen it already. So it's really important that we still need to follow those procedures and other policy requirements to ensure that we are providing an equitable access to the course across different things. As part of that, I think that, you know, it may be reasonable to have something like the idea of delayed summative tasks. So you might do some more formative tasks over potentially a period of school closure, and then have students come back and do a summative task or a graded school-based assessment once they do get back, so that you can still put in place those things. And I know, having had a read of that document from VCAR before, there is quite a lot of information around, you know, if you are going to let a student complete some of a task at home, the types of things that you need to put in place to do that. So I think it's really just about, you know, continuing to stay up to date with those different policies and procedures. If you are new to teaching VCE, often the idea of, your VCE coordinators and other people like that at your schools are a great resource to be able to pick their brain and say, hey, am I allowed to do this? Am I ensuring that I've got, you know, access and equity covered? Am I ensuring that I'm allowing all students to partake and do this equally? And Adriana's just reiterated, make sure you're signing up for the VCAR bulletin and the related VCE messages. And I know that there's also some stuff that's going on the VCAR homepage on potentially a little bit more of a regular basis. So that's potentially worth something, you know, checking when you have a couple of spare minutes. So we'll just open up to some questions. So if you could just type your question in the chat, and if you can potentially remember to just direct it to all panelists and attendees. There's also some excellent questions or excellent couple of suggestions from a few people there. I'm going to start off by going back to a question that was posed earlier by Eliza. So Eliza posed a question, which is, when it states outdoor experiences need to occur before student assessment, does this mean if I went to an environment in the first 2 weeks of this term, I can just refer all my SACs back to that environment / experience, or do I need my students to participate in an outdoor experience before each SAC? So I think, Eliza, given the current circumstances, if you have had a really rich outdoor experience, you know, in a dynamic area that you're able to continue to add different layers to through theoretical teaching, that would be completely appropriate. And maybe what you might do is think about the idea of, you know, can I embed an additional experience to help link with that theory. So, you know, as an example, if you went to the Mornington Peninsula for historical and did things like the first settlement and other different aspects like that, and now you're moving into something like primary industries, could you do a Google tour that looks at the Safety Beach mussel farm as an example of that? Just waiting to see if there's any other questions. So there's a comment about the idea of, can I link a SAC to students' past outdoor experiences in or out of school? And I think that is definitely, again, a very appropriate modification that you might use at this time. So I know that often the advice given in normal circumstances might be around the idea of, you know, can we try and give develop an experience that's directly related to the SAC and things like that. But, you know, sometimes we do have students with an excused absence for a medical reason or whatever it is, and we might often let them use their previous experience. You know, they came back from somewhere awesome over the summer holidays. You know, that could be the basis of that. I think one of the really important things to check, and this is something that you can easily do through your formative experience, through your formative task, is making sure that, you know, students do they still have a valid understanding of that environment. You know, if they're talking about Wilson's Prom and they haven't been to Tidal River since year 8 camp, it might be a bit of a stretch to get them to really reflect on that. So potentially that might be an opportunity where you could link, you know, a virtual experience as kind of like a refresher that might help them to do that. And I think a comment from Hippie, or a question from Hippie there, could experiences undertaken in 1 and 2 be used as the focus environment for 3 and 4? I think absolutely. Again, maybe just a bit of a virtual refresher. That would be a really appropriate thing to do in this time, I think. Just waiting to see if there's any other questions. So I think, just to recap, you know, that idea of experience really is something that we probably need to treat a little bit more dynamically in this situation. That we want to go through, you know, we want to make sure the students do have current knowledge. So potentially using some formative assessments before a summative task to make sure they still have current knowledge of those things, if it's been, you know, if it's a prior experience, or potentially, you know, adding to a prior experience through a virtual thing. There's just a few more questions here. So there's a question, I think from Corinne, about, in the situation that we go to remote learning for a long period of time, what can be done for summative testing and ensuring the correct procedures. So I'd refer you back to that document that Rachel has put up, that there is advice from VCAR around a few different situations there, in terms of the ability to do things like delaying tasks. So you might be able to delay an assessment task, you might be able to modify it, you know, and there are requirements there around the idea of ensuring moderation and things like that across the class. Things like getting the students to, you know, potentially do it in a limited period of time, and then, you know, sending you a part of it after certain things. There's some pretty good information in that one. So there's a question from Annika. In this current climate, should the journals still be as recent as possible experiences? So I think, again, Annika, it's one of those situations that we're just going to have to be as sort of, I suppose, flexible. And it's probably going to depend a little bit on where you are and what you've done to date. and you know, what you have the ability to do. So, you know, a journal, you know, in a couple of months' time, you might have the ability to, you might be allowed to do a very local experience and base your journal on that. You might have to do a virtual experience and then use that as a refresher for something like a previous experience, like what Adam Hipwell suggested, you know, using your 1-2 experiences from last year if the students did do that. Obviously making sure that, you know, the whole class did it, because some do fast track. You know, that type of approach may be needed.
Josh, I'm just going to jump in there quickly.
Yeah.
I know that Rachel Whittle is in on the call and listening in, and you've just popped a comment in there, Rachel. If it makes it easier and you've got a comment that you want to say, I can give you speaker access. So just let me know in the chat feed if you do have something that you wanted to share verbally to everyone who's in on the call. Thanks.
So in response to Curtis's question there, yeah, if you know, and I think it's quite normal that you might be able to experience one environment, you know, and I think to something like the conflicts. So a lot of people may not be able to go to multiple conflicts, or even, you know, may not be able to go to the conflict types of site depending on where you are located. And then, you know, obviously having 2 in that instance, you know, having a second one that you haven't been to, I think that's fine and completely appropriate to potentially, you know, have an experience that you've had at Wilson's Prom in the start of term 1, or that, you know, because you're local to Wilson's Prom and you know that all the students have been there to go for a surf or whatever it is, and they've told you about that, you know, using that and then bringing in virtual experiences or whatever it is for something like the Alps as a contrast, I think that's a completely appropriate and probably a really, really good thing to do. So Tim Cook's got a question here. With journals for VCE 3 and 4, are the details or rubrics as to how to frame the localized excursion or amount of work needed per journal? So I might refer that one over to Rachel to talk about the descriptors that VCAR does have. If we can turn on Rachel's microphone, Adriana.
Give me a minute. I'm just trying to find Rachel in the list. Rachel, if you have got your mic on, you should be able to speak and answer that question. If I've worked it out.
All right, so
maybe not.
Rachel, jump in if you do have that access, but my advice to Tim around the assessment detail is that schools are the ones ultimately responsible for ensuring that the advice that is contained within the VCE handbook, the OES study design, and then that is obviously supplemented by the further advice to teachers around the idea of that it is also published on the website, needs to be pulled together to be able to create a valid assessment task. Now, I think that, you know, there's multiple different ways of doing the journal, and, you know, there are multiple different formats that you can do, and asking those questions, you know, depending on the situation that you are in. So I would say, you know, it is fine to modify the journal task because of the situation, ensuring that it still meets the requirements as set out by VCAR, and also you can either create your own descriptors or achievement standards, or I believe there are model ones that are set out by VCAR. But if you have any further questions, perhaps just double checking with Rachel Whittle on that one as well. In regard to the idea of SACs and stuff done at home, again, if you if you can go back to that link that has been provided by Rachel, which is VCAR advice, I believe that is beyond OES, and it is for a range of different studies, because obviously we're not the only ones facing this issue, and that's around that. But there is advice in that document about how you might go about undertaking a remote SAC if you need to go down that path. Obviously there are other options that may be in place, such as delaying the completion of summative tasks and just, you know, loading up on some formative ones for now. It's just going to be one of those things that nobody's got the crystal ball and knows what's going to happen next. And it's just about us continuing to be dynamic and do the best we can within the situation.
Rachel, you're now able to speak. So just test that out and see if you can respond now. Rachel? Maybe not.
Maybe not. That's right.
If the microphone appears to be fine, but that's okay. You have popped a note in there in the chat feed just to say that descriptors are not mandated, only advice.
Yep.
So yeah.
So you can use those you may use your own or a modified version that you from the descriptors. So they're there as a support function, I suppose, is probably how I've always seen them. All right.
Josh, having a look through the comments again, just to make sure that everything has been responded to. If anybody in the call still has questions, please make sure that you pop them into the chat feed, or if you think that one of your questions has been missed, just do make a note so that we can answer it while we are still here.
All right, so question from Emma, would you be able to use something like a documentary of an environment as a general experience? So my understanding of that, Emma, is yes, you can, because again, it's in a way, it's still an experience with that outdoor environment. It's just a different experience, or a secondary experience, if you will. So, you know, you've still in a way experienced the outdoor environment. So say you are watching a documentary about somebody climbing a particular pitch or whatever it is, I think it would be very appropriate for the students to still be reflecting on that. Where I think it works well is if we don't necessarily try and get them to pretend like they've had that experience, but, you know, perhaps right in the third person, you know, a person who has an experience of having that first pitch might feel this or whatever it is. So still having that I suppose authenticity to their response. Ben, there's a question: is there a self-reliant component to OES? Are you meaning as in going out and doing something the students have to undertake by themselves? I'm not 100% sure what you mean there, sorry. So Ben, yes, a self-reliant trip. If so, how may this play out in the management of student skills, prep and safety of groups? So there is obviously state by state, and Victoria has the safety guidelines for education outdoors. So obviously, regardless of whatever situation is going on, if something does meet the parameters of an adventure activity, you would need to ensure adherence to that. So if you're thinking, Ben, about the idea of can we do a 2-3 night bushwalk and have the students just off they go by themselves, I think that you'd probably struggle to get that one through a school council approval process in terms of being able to meet the supervision ratios, unless you had something like, and I know there are schools that do things like, you know, you might have a sort of, you know, students independently walk for the day and the teachers are sort of trailing a couple of 100 meters behind, and, you know, the students might feel like they're very isolated, but realistically there's, you know, a 4-wheel drive and a group of supervising teachers within COE the entire time. So there are obviously things you can do, but in terms of a staple, Ben, if your question is, would it be of norm for students to have an extended or a self-driven trip? Yes, the latter example you gave for... So yeah, there's a couple of suggestions there about they could potentially do stuff independently, perhaps, or various things. So yeah, any other questions before we finish up?
Just one quick one. I think, Josh, we've had a few people who have asked this question, and just maybe to confirm, but if you're looking at the journal response tasks, which require the students to obviously reflect on an outdoor or on an experience, can the students use a task that, use an experience that was different for each student, or does it need to refer to the same experience?
Yeah, good question, Adriana. I think that it's fine for them to refer to different experiences as long as the journal task or prompts are written in such a way that the students won't be advantaged or disadvantaged from referring to a different locality. So as an example, let's say Adriana and myself and Rachel are all in a class of OES. Rachel and Adriana did Unit 1 and 2 last year, and as part of their Unit 2 trips, they went for a 3-day bushwalk to the prom. I picked up 3-4 this year, and I didn't do that experience to the prom. So I want to write my task about my family trip to the Murray over summer. Adriana and Rachel want to write their task about their Unit 2 school-based experience. It would be fine if the prompts are open and I can still access that that task and be able to achieve the same level of achievement as the person who's had that alternative experience. But if there was a question in there that specifically related to that experience, but not all students had it, that would not meet the requirements of being able to ensure access and equity, is my understanding.
Thanks, Josh. Good summary there. At the moment, I don't think we've got any more questions coming through, and thank you, Rachel, for confirming that that's correct. If we have any further questions in the last couple of minutes, Cameron, it appears we do have one more question that's come through. Thank you. We'll respond to these as they come through. And yeah, we should be able to stay in for the next couple of minutes to answer any questions that you have.
So Cameron, again, I'd refer you to that document that Rachel's posted up, because that's got all of the different requirements for if you do want to try and run a SAC remotely, and the types of requirements that you need to put in place to ensure that you are able to sign off that the student did his original work and various other things like that. So again, I would refer you back to that document because it does set it out pretty clearly around that. I think in terms of, do we need to necessarily do a SAC the week after the experience? Well, they're potentially going to be using that experience for the exam at the end of the year. So, there's other mechanisms that you could do to maintain the competency of that knowledge if you need to, should it be the case of a extended school closure or period of online learning. But if you do want to go down the path of that, then you are required to follow the advice of VCAR as set out in that document. And again, I think, your VCE coordinators will often be a really good source of knowledge to help you interpret some of that sort of stuff. Or we're very fortunate to have Rachel, who's an excellent source of knowledge, and I'm sure happy to answer a question via email should you have a specific one. All right, Adriana, I think we might be just about done.
Yep. Thank you. If any questions do come through in the meantime, or obviously after the webinar is complete, please feel free to send them across to myself. I'll put my email into the chat feed. So if you do have any questions, OES related, but also VCE, PE, HHD, or health and PE F to 10, please do send them across. We're more than happy to help because we know that at the moment you do have a lot going on. We have been recording this session as well. So if you do need to get access to it, we will be sharing this out in the coming days. So just do keep an eye on our Facebook page where you got the link obviously for today's session. And you may have some colleagues as well who might want to view the recording. All right, so thank you very much. First of all, to Josh for getting this presentation up and running. You've definitely gone over some great teaching ideas and also points around the assessments for our VCE students. Thank you to all of you for attending today. Thank you, Rachel, for providing some insight from a VCAR perspective. And we hope, obviously with school holidays hitting, try and get some downtime. But yeah, obviously we'll be in touch soon and be here to help if you need anything in planning over the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thanks all, and I'll pop my email in the chat as well.